Hello there, and welcome to Sandbox, the podcast brought to you by Buro Happold that asks those big questions about our world and the built environment we placed upon it. This episode is called Resilient by Design, Infrastructure for a Sustainable Future. Infrastructure. It's all around us, but we barely even notice it. And this is exactly as it should be. It is the machinery that keeps our lives running, that keeps traffic flowing on roads, that keeps planes in the air. It keeps water flowing from our taps when we need it. It means our houses can be bathed in warmth and light at the flick of a switch. You get the idea. We take it for granted. Until, that is, it goes wrong. In this episode, we'll be looking at what happens when our critical national infrastructure's resilience is tested to its limits and beyond. What are the risks? What are the challenges? What are the impacts and on whom? In what way are humanity's quantum leaps forward in technology providing solutions and also hitherto unknown levels of threat? What's more, in what way do infrastructure resilience and the climate, therefore the future of our planet, interrelate? I'm delighted to welcome Buro Happold experts to the Sandbox panel today, each with a wealth of experience in the key pillars of managing, maintaining and protecting our infrastructure. We have Paula Gough. Tell us a bit about yourself, Paula.
Hello, Andy. I'm Paula Gough. I'm a chartered civil engineer by background and have a keen interest in how we design and deliver better, greener and more resilient infrastructure that future-proofs us and also gives us a safe and resilient, thriving society. I'm Buro Happold, UK Development Director for Infrastructure, and I focus on transportation chiefly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paula. It's lovely to have you on the show. I'm also delighted to welcome Chris Glover to the panel. Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me. I'm a utilities person. I've spent all my career in utilities in one shape, manner or form for the last 30 years, starting in gas, building oil rigs, moving onshore, doing gas onshore, electricity, water, and latterly consultancy, where I head up the utilities team for Buro Happold, where we provide advice to clients on all aspects relating to utilities, connections, contracts, commercial and technical advice.
Fantastic. So I'm sure you're going to bring lots of infrastructural insight to our panel today. Welcome, Chris. So first of all, let's do a bit of scene setting, shall we? Why is resilience so important in terms of major infrastructure?
It's a good question. There are very different definitions of what infrastructure is. And as we're talking about resilience here, also what resilience is. So I'd like to add that to the definition list, if I may.
Yes, please do.
We were discussing this podcast previously. I thought to myself, where has the word resilience come from? And I had a bit of a Google and was interested to find out that it was actually first used in the field of mechanics and as the ability of an object to return to its original state when it's been subjected to, say, an external force to produce a shape change without it breaking. It was then transformed into general English. It's been defined as the ability of a system or a society or indeed a region to react and absorb, adapt to, as well as recover from a disruptive event, however minor or major that may be, and recover hopefully rapidly and effectively. And then since then, and specifically since 2020, when COVID happened, the word infrastructure resilience has become very important and is the ability of a system-wide recovery after disasters happen. But importantly, infrastructure systems are very different to others. They are actually a very interdependent systems, i.e. the transport infrastructure, rail and road, the power, water and energy, all of these different types of infrastructure, they're all connected together and making its resilience more complex than it ordinarily would be for a simpler system.
Thank you for that etymological rigour there. I like to think that I'm a bit of a wordsmith, and that's something I did not know. So thank you very much for the history of the word resilience. That's absolutely fascinating. And Paul, I'm going to come to you first. So in terms of the UK's infrastructure at the moment, what is the state of our roads, our bridges, our water systems and our energy networks?
So in the UK, we've got quite sophisticated major infrastructure and we've got clever operators that look after that. Since 2020, as I mentioned, infrastructure resilience has become a thing, and actually many pieces of research and policies have been put together. I was interested to find out that, say, in 2013, there was as many of about 3 papers about infrastructure resilience. In 2020, we had almost 100 papers about what infrastructure resilience was. And therefore, what I'm trying to say by this is that governments have come into tune with what infrastructure, the state of infrastructure is both from a renewal and reset perspective, but also from how does our infrastructure respond to climate change? How does it respond to war, terror, etc.? So we are in a good place to really ramp up activity on how we look after infrastructure resilience. What we need is investment prioritization, integration between different types of infrastructure, and understand that really intricate interdependency that there is between different types, and really engage the industry to begin to act for upgrading our general infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Paula. That's absolutely fascinating. And Chris, what are your thoughts on the current state of the UK's infrastructure?
I think critical national infrastructure obviously has grabbed the headlines recently with the events at Heathrow Airport and the blackout in Spain. And that's probably brought a focus onto something which has been managed in the background in the past. I think it's a tired phrase, but the world's changing. If you think back only a few years ago, electricity was just for lighting in the house. Now people work from home, internet, everything runs off of power. So critical national infrastructure, is quite difficult to pin down in some respects, because we hit the light switch and we expect the lights to work. We turn the tap and we expect the water to flow. We turn the heating on, we expect to get warm. But there's critical national infrastructure that sits behind that, and making sure that that is, fit for purpose, reliable, with arguably increased expectations from the public, with the double challenge, of course, look at the water industry with sewage and waste and pollution. No one wants to pay for it. And that's the dichotomy with critical national infrastructure, is how you ensure that there's something that's resilient, fit for purpose, provides a service that is value for money. And I think it's probably fair to say that, we're still evolving that, and this space is evolving in what would not have been considered critical infrastructure in the past now is. And that's something where, we need to sort of help understand what the risks are, what we need to do to manage those assets, and how we ensure that you balance that risk and cost.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much. And in terms of the current state of investment in infrastructure, where do you think we're standing with that?
I think that there's been different approaches taken in different sectors. So if you look in the power sector, the regulator, Ofgem, has taken an increasingly more long-term view. The problem with critical national infrastructure, a lot of it is you could stop all spending like next year. So we've all seen power lines running across fields and going through woods. You need to cut the trees. You could stop all tree cutting next year and not have a problem. The year after, you wouldn't have a problem. Maybe not the year after that. But at some point, you've got trees everywhere, the wind blows and everything falls down. And that's been the problem with utility critical national infrastructure, is because water pipes last for like over 100 years. So spending in the short term is hard to measure. And in power, I think a lot of work's been done about asset condition and asset health, and ensuring that the network overall has got a good health, as well as providing the capacity that's required. I think with water, that hasn't happened. With water, the imperative for the regulator was to keep bills down. And I think the fact that there have been no new reservoirs in the last 30 years since privatisation, the first ones going in Portsmouth, down in Havant, sort of tells a story. The UK population has gone up by 10, 20 million in that time. We haven't built any reservoirs. And that's a long-term investment. So I think that it's different sectors. So I think power sector, has looked at the long-term approach and the investment and what's needed, whereas water, I think, has taken a more short-term approach. And that's why we're seeing all the stories, and all the questions in the media about pollution and water bills and where we're going, I think is a result of that lack of investment since 1990.
Right, I see. When you think about, the person on the street, your average Joe like me, the social media pages of the town where I live get very exercised about the state of, say, the roads in our town. We've even had a national tabloid newspaper come up and they ran a photo story with one of the residents using the potholes in the road as a makeshift mini golf course. My questions to the panel are, what are the impacts of ageing and or poorly maintained infrastructure, and in what way are the different sections of society affected, and from the person on the potholed streets all the way up to big business? And I'm thinking here about well-being and livability, health, safety, daily quality of life. Chris, what are your thoughts about the impact on elements of society?
Like I was talking about with tree cutting with power lines, potholes is a good example. You don't spend enough money on potholes in year one. No one notices. You get to where we are now, where, the backlog is, hundreds of years, millions of pounds. And, there's questions about whether we've got resources to get that repaired within a reasonable timescale and a reasonable cost. That's, for me, is a good example of making sure you've got that asset stewardship where you're maintaining the proper asset health, whether that's road. Rails is another good example where, we've seen stuff in the past with lack of investment in the rails, whether that's, in the autumn, keeping leaves off the line, which you think is really simple, but has, major impact on the man in the street when all the trains are being cancelled and leaves on the line. Not a very good message. That for me is a good example of where a modest amount of spend on an annual basis keeps everything running, whereas saving that money really creates a much disproportionately larger problem later on down the line. And that's where this whole approach to critical national infrastructure, has to make sure that sufficient funds are allowed and sufficient intelligence applied to put that spend in the right place, because you don't want to just throw money at it. You want to put it into an area that, like a pothole in the road, is a discernible benefit to the man in the street.
It's interesting that leaves on the line has become such a profound shorthand for infrastructural breakdowns, let's say. Paula, what are your thoughts on the impacts of underfunding of infrastructure or failings of infrastructure on Joe Public and beyond?
So whether it's potholes or track buckling due to heat. I was reading a paper recently that said in 2024, within the 240 days in the calendar year where there was train disruption of some sort due to buckling rail lines or due to overhead power lines being overstretched, all associated with some sort of weather condition. And I think increasingly that impact is going to affect people, society, economic growth, and well-being of our people and children. There are so many children that are impacted by not being able to reach education due to disruption to transportation. And those of us living in urban areas where we might have different ways of getting to places might not understand that, but actually a tree down on your local urban road in Wales means you're not getting to school. So which takes us back to the point of resilience. Not only we have great impacts now on society on different dimensions, that impact is going to evolve and change as we face more dramatic climate risk, terror risk, other types of risk. So I think governments and industries and professionals have a real onerous task to think through how these things will evolve, what the impact will be on societies, and try to solution and work with the asset operator, whether it's National Highways, say for roads, or it's Network Rail for rail, to come up proactively with ideas to minimize this disruption, because the impact of that is very, very negative at all levels.
Thank you, Paula. And rather handily, you've sort of anticipated my next question, so we can do a nice seamless segue now. Because It's pretty safe to say, even I can see as, Joe Public on the street, infrastructure is vital and we need to keep it running. So we need to make it resilient. Paula, I'm going to come to you first. What do we need to be considering when talking about the resilience of infrastructure? You've referenced there sort of climate change, flooding, heat waves, the ability to withstand shocks. What should we be considering?
There is a clear framework for how resilience is defined and considered. There are different dimensions to resilience, whether it's technical or it's organizational, social or economic. There are different properties to resilience, whether it's robustness, it's sort of rapidity or redundancy. There's also outcomes that we seek from infrastructure resilience, where there are clear outcomes that governments seek, and that is to make infrastructure more reliable and able to have faster recovery. I gave you the example of the overhead power lines and rail. Asset operators are in the process of changing the materials so that it's not so affected by heat, for example, so that we have less and less disruption. But ultimately, we just want to reduce the consequences of any kind of disruption on infrastructure. And by thinking through all of these different dimensions and aspects, we'll be able to identify our priorities. And by integrating it, I talked about interdependency in infrastructure. So if you want your railways to run properly, you need to have the power, you need to take account of utilities and drainage to make sure that it's not flooded. And I think that enables us to prioritize how we would tackle better, more resilient and green infrastructure. And the first step I would take to that is be more specific in our policy, in our government policy, to take action. And we've recently gained an organization called NISTA, which is responsible for making sure that the 10-year infrastructure strategy is being delivered and holding everybody accountable for that. And I believe they play a big role in adding that infrastructure resilience piece in, because without it, we can't meet climate related issues. Actually, our action towards climate change will be hampered by inaction towards the resilience piece. And there's huge evidence for this.
Yeah. I've got a couple of questions for you on the back of that, actually, Paula. For a start, are you able to summarise in a nutshell the desired outcomes of the 10-year infrastructure strategy? What's its overarching ambition?
I think overarching ambition is to achieve value for money and create a thriving economy aligned to the government's missions have been announced. And I think we've made really good inroads for that. And the reason why I mentioned NISTA is that they're responsible for the infrastructure side of that. But I think the 10-year infrastructure strategy needs to balance its investment in different parts. So a lot of that is going to be to do with intervention to renew the asset, to make sure that the asset is fit for purpose, if you like. Another one is around becoming future focused. So, for example, we're talking about driverless cars. We're talking about, in the interim, we're talking about more and more electric cars. Have we got an infrastructure? We've got enough charge points on our motorway to enable more electric cars to be driven by people? People talk about range anxiety, getting over what public perceive as blockers to them moving to the next chapter, if you like. And thirdly, integration. And I think that's had probably the least amount of attention so far in infrastructure industry. And as looking at how do we integrate the needs of society, whether it's water, power, rail, road, transportation, or indeed information security and cyber, into one place and have that sort of one roadmap of how we're going to go from where we are, using the resources and the monies we've got to tackle the priorities that the country has.
Yeah, and Paula, just one other thing, and you've referenced it there again, actually, is with the interdependence, and I totally see the logic of and the necessity for all infrastructure to be interdependent. Is there also a risk in that if one goes down, that will impact on the others? And how do we mitigate against that?
Absolutely. That interdependency is very important when it comes to infrastructure, and it's unique as far as the infrastructure systems are concerned. And without that assurance, we're not going to achieve those outcomes of better reliability, faster recovery, and the lower consequences. If we want those outcomes and benefits from more resilient infrastructure, we do have to achieve that more integrated thinking and integrated delivery where we invest. So rather than just think about road or rail, think about connectivity and how do we actually go from A to B, or how do we assure different routes from A to B in a situation of a disaster, in a situation of a flood risk or a power cut, etc.
Yeah, so a holistic helicopter view, if you will, yeah. Thank you. And Chris, how do our water and energy systems need to adapt?
Very good question, Andy. And it sort of links into what Paula was just saying. You've got two aspects to resilience. You've got the one side, which is how well the asset responds to stress. So if it's a pylon, how much wind will it take before it gets blown down? But then there's the other side, is what do you design it to? Now, the climate has undeniably changed in the UK in my time.
Yeah.
I went to school and we got -20 in the winter. You just don't get that now. And the summer breaks temperatures. And for example, for power, we talked about designing the overhead lines for a 1 in 20 wind. We now get a 1 in 20 storm almost every year. And water assets talk about a 1 in 100 flood event. We're getting year after year a 1 in 100 flood event. So one of the big questions for infrastructure in the UK, roads melting is a good example, rails buckling, is what do we design the infrastructure to going forward? Because the standards that we used in the past clearly are not applicable.
Yeah.
And with the environment changing, with more frequent storm events, with hotter events, clearly it's not just the existing assets, but any new assets that we put in, any new infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, we're going to have to think about what are we designing to, and that's going to have to be a harsher environment.
Yeah. And you've talked with energy systems about shifting from centralized to localized systems. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, I think when we talk about how critical national infrastructure has changed, our perception and our use of power has changed, but how that power is generated has also significantly changed in recent years. In the past, we burned coal in big fast power stations in the north because that's where the coal was, and power was moved from north to south and it went from top down, and that's the way it was done. Now we don't have these coal-fired power stations. We have power stations everywhere. We've got people like myself with panels on their roof. You've got generating power at the end. The system was never designed for power to go back up the system, but now it is. And that means you can't just turn a power station at one end off and on and run it. It means you're going to have to manage almost like you do with a road network where you've got traffic lights and junctions and you reroute traffic. You need to do that with power,
right? Which
is a whole different way of doing it, which is what the industry is now bringing in. And that's more about managing it in real time. An example, Octopus Energy were giving half price electricity last night if you charged your car up last night, but not tonight. That's because they've got a surplus of power on Sunday, but not Monday. So you've got two ways of managing supply and demand. One is to get more supply, generate more power. The other is just to shift demand.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And I just want to ask, with water, you've referred to it already, but like dealing with the contaminants, harvesting and recycling, I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Again, when we look at what we did originally, as an engineer, it doesn't make sense. We produce medical grade water and we chuck it down the toilet, literally.
Yeah.
The majority of people's use, as I say, medical grade water, majority of the use, it's not ingested. Yet that's how the system's set up. And there are far more efficient ways of working where you can use what's called grey water.
Yeah.
So you harvest the water off your roof into butts. You can flush the toilet with that quite happily. And that significantly reduces, the demand that the home has. If you look at, so there's two sides to it. There's that efficiency side, but there's also the demand side when you look at how much water people use because it's cheap.
Yeah.
People don't see it as something that has to be rationed or treated carefully. So the water that side has changed dramatically over the years. It means we're going to have to be more efficient with the use of the water that we've got. A useful stat is London's drier than Sydney.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's extraordinary.
Which people don't think. We think of the UK because we portray the UK as being this grey,
yeah.
wet and windy and miserable land.
Yeah, we're almost proud of it.
Yeah. Actually, the southeast quite arid.
Well, that's extraordinary. And I'm going to move on now to the climate. I know we've already talked a bit about the climate already, but I mean, because obviously there's an explicit relationship between the climate and infrastructure resilience. We've already looked at how climate can impact on the resilience of a building, but the relationship works both ways. Paula, when we've chatted before, you emphasised the importance of balancing investment in new projects with maintaining and upgrading existing infrastructure to ensure resilience and continuity. You added that without tackling resilience first, progress on climate change cannot be made. Why is this, Paula?
They are interchangeable. So there's flooding, there's heat waves, there is carbon reduction efforts. That's why we're talking about this interdependency and this integration requirement, and the need for cross-sector collaboration to look at combined impact of these across our infrastructure. If we plan in isolation for each of these, we could be planning for the wrong level of impact, or we could be shooting ourselves in the foot where we take a measure of something that actually could be covered elsewhere, whether that's flooding or response to heat, whether it's coming up with new services for our roads to respond to one area than the other. So that integration piece is really important. There are several papers out there that describes why we need to be looking at resilience in order to actually align to the carbon trajectory. Part of resilience is ensuring that your asset is in a good state, so that when there is a flood risk or there is a unusual weather, they are actually able to function in the way that they are meant. Otherwise, they have damaging impacts on our progress towards carbon reduction. For example, flooding leading to loss of habitats or inaction for nature loss solutions, having a dramatic impact on species that we see in the UK, which in turn has an impact on climate. So they are completely intertwined, and in order for us to achieve good outcomes for our infrastructure, we do need to look at these interdependencies and collaborate cross sectors for those best results.
Thank you very much. Now, panel, this is the part of the show where we don our silver flight suits and travel forward in time across some beautifully maintained and digitised temporal plane. What changes would you like to see in infrastructure in the next 20 years? Critical national infrastructure. I'm going to go to Chris first. You can time travel first, Chris. What would you like to see in the next 20 years?
That's a very good question.
Thank you.
I think a more honest and public debate about funding versus the supply that we need. So I think in 20 years' time, the critical national infrastructure would be constructed for what we are going to need, not what we have needed. Standards in the UK tended to be rearward looking. So we did something 30, 40 years ago, and that's what we do now. Rail's a good example. You know, we've still got rails on the ground in the southeast. That was a cheap way of doing it in the Victorian times. And there's all sorts of reasons why that's not appropriate now, never mind going forward. So I think in 20 years' time, critical national infrastructure should be designed for what we think it's going to need over its life, what it needs to provide in the future, its future, not in this point in time, because I think that's where we go wrong. We look backwards, so it's driving in the rearview mirror, and then we wonder why we've hit something.
That's a brilliant phrase. Thank you very much. And Paula, what would you like to see in the next 20 years?
I think that puts us to 2045, doesn't it, Andy? So certainly by 2050, 25 years, I'd like to see infrastructure that is of zero harm to people and of zero harm an impact to the planet. So a net zero infrastructure and zero harm in terms of whether it's people or workers. I'd like to see that. The list is long, but another low-hanging fruit and something that will take us through that journey in the next 20 years is around making good policy and good strategies. Because as we said, infrastructure and resilience of infrastructure is very, very complex. And infrastructure is not a thing itself. It's not like an end. It's a means to an end. Therefore, is going to require really clear strategy, and I would like to see that be completely embedded in real infrastructure evidence that's drawn from reliable data that both the operators hold today, but also the consultants like us and other supply chain partners hold, to make sure that we've got the right strategy and we're all going towards the correct North Star of being zero harm and zero carbon future infrastructure.
Thank you, Paula. That's a great answer. So there we have it. Infrastructure is not one world, it's at least two that bridge the real world and the digital realm. At its best, this is the very machinery of modern living that keeps our lives ticking along from one day to the next and from one destination to another. It is the swan's legs paddling furiously beneath the surface. There is that line that we all use when our computers and printers play up. Technology's great, when it works. And so it is with our critical national infrastructure. But, as we've discovered today, we also need to be facing the future constantly, thinking about how the choices we make now impact on the infrastructure and therefore the future of the world and the life we want to live on it. And it has to be resilient and it has to be joined up. And with that, another episode of Sandbox draws to a close. I would like to thank the infrastructural visionaries and guardians from Buro Happold who have formed our panel today. Thanks, panel. You'll find Sandbox in all the usual sources of podcast goodness. There are many other episodes for you to explore and enjoy, each as eclectic as they are fascinating. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.